and welcome to Purely in Conversation, Later Life Lending with Pure Retirement, hosted by me, Jane Mullen. In today's episode, we have guest speaker Phil Dockerill, Director at Equity Release Compliance. Phil, thank you so much for joining us today and a huge welcome to you. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. It's a good day.
Good. Well, we're very excited to have you. I'm looking forward to getting through some interesting content today. First of all, Phil, can you introduce yourself? I'd love to know more about your role at the Equity Release Compliance and what your day-to-day looks like.
Of course, Jane, with pleasure. Well, I'm called Phil Dockerill. I've got a history as an advisor, but most of my time has been spent in compliance and training. That's helping firms and individual advisors to provide a service that meets regulatory standards, but mostly one that they can be proud of. These days, I'm pretty much only involved with equity release, and in that capacity, I work on a contract basis with a couple of splendid networks. And also a handful of directly authorised firms, including my old brokerage that was sold to existing staff 2 or 3 years ago. So that's currently about 70 advisors in total. To do this, I've designed and published equity release advice processes and standards. That's mostly for the networks, but I apply the same standards to the directly authorised firms. I also arrange induction for new advisors, regular CPD training for experienced people. I guess there are a couple of things that take up most of my time on a daily basis. The most formal of these is a review of advice files before presentation. I check the documentation, fact-finding, formulation of advice and a suitability report to validate the recommendation. And in view of the urgency for getting the advice to clients, that's often the driver for the timing of my days. The other major part is actually taking calls from advisors who are looking for a bit of guidance, usually on how to address a case. So for newer people, this could be pretty basic stuff, which is fine. But for more experienced advisors, this is more of a discussion about the issues a case might present. I'm there as maybe just a sounding board for their thoughts. And of course, I tuck in observations and feedback and other bits and pieces during the day.
Sounds like one day is never the same. There's lots going on, but it does sound interesting as well.
I love what I do. I'm very happy to be at this point in time, looking after an equity release role. And you're right, there are no 2 days that are the same.
Oh, keeps it interesting. And in your experience, Phil, what are the most common compliance pitfalls that you do come across in your work?
I think the most basic problem is that advisors haven't always come to grips with the scope of their role. They don't always recognise that later life advice requires a much broader approach than they're used to in dealing with, for example, standard residential mortgages. And they believe that all they need to do is to recommend the cheapest product to fulfil the client's request. That's pretty much all new equity release advisors, but also some experienced advisors I meet as they join the networks. I think an equity release recommendation is only partially about the product. It should be considered as later life financial planning in the broadest sense. This includes an analysis of current and future spending to ensure that there are no financial shocks that are going to be hard to deal with in future, understanding client intentions for their estate, discussing the impact on beneficiaries and other residents, generally making sure there are no financial obstacles that can be foreseen and overcome for the future. So to do this, the later life advisor needs to assess whether clients are making financial decisions that are detrimental to their long-term interest. What are the factors that have led to a client to wanting to release equity? Does it fit with their long-term ability to fund essential expenditure, and so on? I guess the lack of understanding about their role can lead to problems in the way they treat clients as well. Like, equity release advisors need to be willing to challenge client assumptions and objectives far more than for a standard resi situation. And clients, the result is more order taking and feeling that they've done what the client wants as opposed to what the client needs.
Mm,
I guess it also means that there are potential cases where equity release has been advised where the solution is actually detrimental to their future financial well-being.
mm. And if we look at the firms as well as the advisors, how do you think that firms can better prepare for regulatory scrutiny?
Um, so from what we've said, clearly an understanding of the role of the advisor is paramount, and designing their processes and procedures to fit that understanding is clearly very important. But actually, there's not very much that's new in what needs to be done. So firms need to establish a robust but flexible advice process that's suitable for later life customers, and that's one that where things come out of the Equity Release Council mystery shopping demonstrated the need to accommodate specific characteristics for later life customers and to give them time to gain understanding or to assimilate information. So that's maybe having introductory meetings to prepare for fact finding, allow fact finding meetings to go over one or two, or maybe even three instances, so that the client doesn't become too fatigued. Firms need to establish uh, sound advice principles that support clients in later life, but which allow flexibility based on the personal circumstances of the client. And clearly, firms need to have evidence that advisors are competent, both initially and that they remain so. And that means regular file checking and observations.
Mm,
Identifying sales trends to check for indicators that might show client ability is useful, and using that information to inform amendments to processes and standards. I guess demonstrating that all these things are regularly reviewed in line with regulatory feedback and sales trends, and the details that come from observation and feedback is also important. So, as I say, I don't think there's anything really new, but it needs to be applied diligently.
mm. I agree. And I'm interested, Phil, to understand what your view is on balancing innovation with compliance.
Oh, I love innovation. That printing press was a great idea. Telephones are brilliant.
Mm.
The internal combustion engine helps people get to appointments. Um, Seriously, Douglas Adams, who was a bit of a hero of mine, had a take on innovation along the lines of that anything existed before you were born is natural and the normal state of things. Anything developed before you were about 40 is wonderful and exciting, and that innovations experienced after that were unnatural and against God. Um,
Mm.
I guess I should modify the age range a bit because we're also used to change. Um, Things we think of now as normal ways of working were once innovative, and we have a history of applying changes safely. I guess that there are a couple of things that we need to think about when we consider innovation currently, and that's in the way we do things, but it's mostly to do with dealing with clients. So, remote meetings, for example, is this a valid way to deal with later life clients? It can be, but the advisor has to judge whether they can be sure they notice vulnerabilities to ensure each client is fully engaged with the process and understands the commitments and consequences. But actually, that's true of face-to-face meetings now. I encourage face-to-face meetings, but actually, although that's the default, anything there are lots of circumstances where remote meetings are both helpful and in some cases essential.
Mm.
Um, I guess the biggest thing is the use of AI to support the sales process. Um, Unfortunately, we can't always be sure the factors that influence AI decision making are valid. So the old computer term was sort of garbage in, garbage out, and that's as true now as it's always been. If AI is used to help with forecasts and projections, or to help generate more client-friendly communication, that's great. But if we rely on it to make advice decisions, we are on shaky ground. So Innovation that helps make fact-finding more effective so that the more time can be spent on quality conversation is fab. Anything that helps the advisor communicate more effectively is also something to be applauded. But when it comes to decision making, there may eventually be room for AI, but it will need a firm human grasp on the outcomes to make it safe and reliable.
Mm. Maybe something like AI, it can be useful as a tool to complement the process rather than using it, specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of advisors now who are experimenting with using AI to analyze, for example, a fact find to calculate more quickly and easily what, in joint cases, what the survivor would earn in the event that they lose their partner. But that's the kind of thing that's really helpful because it's kind of reliable and it speeds up the process. But
Mm,
it's the decision making aspect of it that I would be concerned about at the moment.
mm. And I know we touched upon this slightly at the beginning, but how do you support advisors in understanding but also applying regulations as well?
I guess the most relevant help for most advisors in the form of feedback on file checks. It's not the only way, but it is sort of pertinent for every advisor.
Mm,
Um, Although it makes for extensive and I've been told sometimes daunting levels of comment, I always explain the reasoning behind any kind of feedback to files. I guess if I outlined the kind of three outcomes from file checking, that would help. So the first outcome is that a file appears to record detailed exploration and client needs and circumstances with suitable recommendation, and it's good to move forward in presenting advice. This might still have some comments on what makes it acceptable, but largely it's for the advisor, it's good to go. The next outcome is that the file is fundamentally sound, but there may be some tweaks to the way the advice is explained before that recommendation is presented. And the last outcome is the possibility that there are some flaws in the file. It doesn't mean the advice is poor. It's just that we haven't covered all of the bases, so there may be questions to be answered or other actions to be taken. The point is that all of those options with feedback include a reasoning as to why the specific feedback is given. And I find this is the most effective way to embed understanding with the advisor.
mm,
Another approach is to be open to calls and remote meetings with advisors who want to discuss specific cases. I happily spend time with advisors looking for help or guidance or just wanting me as a sounding board, really.
mm,
And the other approach, which is not as personal but is still helpful, is the regular, what might be called CPD training on current topics. I tend to use case studies adapted from recent file checks and hope that advisors thinking about these would how they would think about the approach they would use to a similar case if they were to face it. But I also have kind of experts to come to present various issues. So you had Matt Taylor from Equilaw on one of your podcasts previously, and he was kind enough to come along earlier in the year to do a talk for advisors on addressing cases that are in trust. So it really is a case of when dealing with advisors, it's the individual approach that I find is most helpful in kind of developing their knowledge and understanding.
mm. And that leads us on nicely to our next question, talking about advice packs and file checking. So, what role does documentation play in demonstrating suitability?
It's a bit of a cliche, but if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. And the most important document is the suitability report. Although we address it to the clients and it needs to be produced in a way that satisfies their needs, I always check a suitability report as if it's being presented in evidence to defend a complaint. I know that sounds negative, But if the suitability report demonstrates to FOS, to a FOS investigator or to an ombudsman, that the advisor has followed a flexible and sympathetic process, they properly investigated the customer's needs and circumstances, they've tied up loose ends and inconsistencies, they've handled any apparent vulnerability and made a suitable recommendation on borrowing, budgeting and estate planning, which is communicated in a way that's easy for the client to digest, then they must have done a proper job with the client. Mm. It's not just what it says, but how it says it. Advisors need to be mindful of the way that the suitability report is laid out and the language used to make it as digestible as possible. Mm. The Equity Release Council published a report a couple of years ago in partnership with the Fairer Finance organisation, which gives guidance in this area, and it's worth a look for anyone designing client-facing documentation. The aim is to provide a document that's free from anything that would maybe snag an ombudsman's sense of what is right. I'll give you an example. I tend to recommend that whatever template an advisor uses as the basis for the report, that they actually add a facing one-page summary at the beginning that covers the client's objectives and the advice recommendations, how the recommendation fulfills client needs and risks involved. This isn't anything a client needs to know. That isn't everything a client needs to know about equity release, but it does mean they get the fundamentals without having to wade through 25 pages of a suitability report. And it also helps by layering complex information that should make it easier for them to assimilate. Of course, the recommendation has to be supported with accurate and easy to read sourcing, KFI that matches the sourcing, advice checks, checks on potential benefits where appropriate, evidence of debts or mortgage being consolidated, bank statements, and so on. But the most important document of all of those is absolutely the suitability report.
Thank you for sharing that tip. That's really useful. Thank you. And how do you assess and manage risk across different client profiles?
I guess the first thing is that each case is tailored to the specific needs of the particular client or couple. It's helpful to have a general understanding of the characteristics of particular types of client and the situations they face, but ultimately each solution is unique to the people in front of the advisor. I do look for what might be described as need sales and assess them in a different way from what the LIBF exams used to call lifestyle sales. Need sales are those where the client has no choice but to raise money in some way and has no other resources but equity. Equity release may or not be the right answer here. It works well if the client can recover their financial situation and get back on an even keel, and if they will still be able to manage essential expenditure in the future. On the other hand, if the file demonstrates that borrowing is only a temporary solution and they will be unable to manage financially in future and eventually have to sell up, it's better to do that sooner rather than later and avoid the costs associated with borrowing. So I'm a bit more sympathetic to need clients, but we still need to be sure that borrowing is in their best interest. Lifestyle customers have a choice whether expenditure is necessary, and if they choose to spend it, they have options as to how to fund it. It's right to try to help them fulfill their needs, whether it's making gifts, having a nicer retirement, or one of 1,000 things I see coming from advisors every year. In that case, the file needs to demonstrate the client's got a good relationship with money and generally makes prudent spending decisions. Also, that their plan to release equity now will not deprive them of the ability to manage future essential expenditure. I also look for valid reasoning why alternative assets are not being used, but that discussion is needed within the restrictions of the FCA permissions that allow of what the FCA allow an advisor to cover. I guess vulnerability is important here. The council has recently published a very detailed document on dealing with vulnerable clients. I think this might be hard for the average advisor to assimilate fully and apply as it sits, but it covers the ground well. My approach is to look for any factors in the client's circumstances that might lead them to make short-term decisions without consideration of the longer-term financial well-being. Where this kind of vulnerability exists, we not only record any mitigating actions, but I also ask advisors to make a clear statement in the suitability report that they believe, despite of the perceived issue, the client is able to make financial decisions that are in their long-term best interest.
And you mentioned the FCA, which again leads us on nicely to the next area of discussion. So, what trends, Phil, are you seeing when we think about FCA expectations?
Um, I think much of the most recent material from the FCA has been about product design and provision. I tend to be on the other side of that, responding to market changes brought about by what lenders have to offer. In my kind of advisory environment, certainly around mortgages in general, FCA concerns are about embedding consumer duty within the advice process and standards, and that includes expectations on the advisor to be more thorough with affordability assessments and long-term financial stability. These are currently normal expectations with equity release, but I think it may raise the game for a number of standard residential mortgage advisors. There's a focus on mortgage prisoners that I think might have some impact on equity release advice, given the length of time that some of these contracts have been in place. The FCA is also talking about streamlining the process in the way clients are managed. It's as much about client experience as it is about the advice that they're given, and this is supported with the need for more data-driven assessment, using tech to provide management information that can be used to help streamline processes. It's going to be worthwhile for bigger organisations that can generate meaningful stats, I guess. I'm not sure about the smaller advice firms. Clearly, I hope we're ahead of the game, but the price for that is ongoing thought and vigilance about the way we treat customers, and to be comfortable that if we are doing the best job for clients, that we are automatically fulfilling regulatory expectation.
And having discussed FCA expectations, I'm interested to hear how you help firms stay ahead of any regulatory changes that come about.
Is there regulatory change? I think the aim of conduct regulation is to protect the customer, and in the current parlance, that means providing and demonstrating good customer outcomes. What does change over time is the regulator's expectation of what good outcomes look like. Now we are human beings and we can put ourselves in the customer's shoes, and the best way to deal with future compliance issues is to be sure that advisors are advising on the whole client situation, not just their immediate needs. It's about staying ahead of the game. The FCA published a couple of thematic reviews in relation to equity release. They were in 2020 and 2023. And they talked about issues that were in relation to poor assessment of debt consolidation, insufficient attention to a client's overall financial situation, generally about examples of unsuitable advice. But there was nothing there that would have been a surprise to someone who's cliently focused on their true role as a later life advisor. So to help with firms, I monitor FCA guidelines, watch the changing market, absorb information from child checks and observations and so on, and to keep myself sharp really and up to date. But I also look at ombudsman decisions published by the Financial Ombudsman Service. Most complaints against for equity release payments are against lenders, but that where there is an advice complaint, not only the complaints that are upheld, but any complaint, I look to see what could have been done differently to avoid that complaint arising, and use that information when I'm thinking about amendments to advice process and so on.
Mm.
So using that information, I review processes, advice standards for the firms I work for and adapt them over time. By way of an example, 3 or 4 years ago, it wasn't common to collect bank statements from equity release clients, but now my advisors validate income and expenditure using client bank statements as a matter of course.
Mm.
And that's been a bit of a revelation for some. I run regular training for advisors to address issues that crop up, but we've kind of talked about those things already.
Certainly sounds like you've got eyes and ears everywhere, Phil, to make sure that you're kept up to date, that you don't miss anything.
I would say that actually the help from lenders in
Mm.
the kind of services that you provide, and specifically, Jane, your kind of feedback on what's happening in the market with our own advisors is particularly useful.
Mm. Right, that's great. Thank you. It's good to hear that. And Phil, what advice would you give to advisors about embedding compliance into their processes?
This is going to sound like a dodgy audio loop, but I hope you'll forgive me for repeating the idea. Compliance should not be seen as a set of rules to satisfy a regulator. Um, there are rules that need to be followed, but they aren't much more than a set of minimum standards about fairness or transparency or the safety for the client. Every client will have a unique set of financial goals or family dynamics or the ability to make rational financial decisions. And it isn't possible to apply a single set of rules to cope with every situation an advisor might come across. So, embedding compliance should be based on dealing with clients effectively and sympathetically. The rules are a backstop, they're the pilot's flight test. But understanding the advisor role in providing good outcomes for clients is the most important objective.
Mm.
Um, During induction, I talk about, by way of an example, unacceptable objectives, the reasons that people might give for releasing equity that should never be fulfilled. But actually, I also go on to say that I'm always willing to discuss a case where those rules might be modified, where usually unacceptable objectives might make sense for a particular client. So it really is client based. The trick for advisors is to be genuinely client focused and to develop the ability to put themselves in the client's shoes. We customarily call that empathy. But to be able to thoroughly explore the client objectives and reveal their hopes and aspirations, their reason for their need to release equity, their fears and concerns, maybe even their experience and assumptions, and the road that's led them to look for financial planning. Now, that level of empathy is a big ask, but like all skills, it can be developed over time.
Mm.
That of course, and to build relationships with with a good supervisor who can provide a separate pair of eyes and offer an objective support. I
Mm.
can't imagine who that might be.
Well, we said at the beginning, didn't we, how one day, Phil, isn't the same from the next for you. And I think it certainly, sounds like there's no case, there's no client that is the same. Everyone is completely individual. Every case is different, and they should be treated as such.
No, that's absolutely true. There is no generic profile. Every client needs to be considered on an individual basis.
Mm. And Phil, we do have one final question, and this is one that has become quite famous on the Purely in Conversation podcast. We do ask it to everybody, but it's a really nice question to finish the podcast on. So, my question to you is, if you could take your younger self out for a coffee, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, that's really difficult. Partly because it wasn't going out for coffee. It wasn't a thing when I was young. Starbucks hadn't yet been invented. I don't think.
No,
Uh,
no.
um, I guess it might have been to think more carefully about career decisions. I was almost 40 before I became. I know this sounds a surprise to people, but before I became self-employed, I lived in a world that got on the train at 7:30 into town every morning, went to the pub for lunch, and spent my days following somebody else's objectives. And looking back, maybe I should have spent less time pursuing the corporate hierarchy and more time ploughing my own furrow, as it were.
Mm.
But I probably wasn't ready until that age. Some of us are really late starters.
Yeah.
I can look back over my working life now and see exactly how I came to be involved in supporting equity release advisors. But there was no clear indication at the time, um, other than to do things that I was interested in. I'm afraid I've got a history of making wild changes because a job was making me miserable or just not interesting enough. And maybe I should have had more sticking power. I don't know. Um,
Mm.
I'm not sure it's possible to plan a career in detail. There's some brilliant TED talks by a guy called Sir Kenneth Robinson regarding education. And part of his text is that creativity is as important as literacy because we can't predict what the future world will be like. And it isn't possible to prepare people to do jobs that are not yet defined. For the first half of my working life, financial services didn't look anything like the way they look now, and equity release wasn't even a thing.
Mm.
Um, but by accident, I guess, I'm of an age now um, where I've got appropriate experience to do a job that I love and where I feel I can make a genuine contribution to the equity release world. I'm not sure that can be planned for.
No, no. Well, that's great advice. And I think the content that you shared with us today, you've given some great hints and tips for people. It's been so wonderful to have you on the podcast today. So insightful. And yeah, can't wait for our listeners to hear all of this. Phil, you've been fantastic. And yeah, thank you so much from me. It's been wonderful to have you.
It's lovely to be here, Jane. Thank you.